get us going.
Okay. Our Heavenly Father, thank you for loving us. We thank you for bringing us into participation into your very nature through our Lord Jesus Christ, helping us to love one another. We ask your blessing here as we discuss this essay. We give you thanks for it and the one who wrote it and the one who will interview him. Thank you for our gathering. We ask your blessing on the thoughts we think, the words we speak, that they might be pleasing to you. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, through him and with him. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Bill.
Well,
What are you, Geordie?
all right. How's my sound? You hear me all right?
It sounds fine to me.
Sounds good.
All is
right.
well.
I'm actually going to swap the angles here just for better light. So Marty, today we get to talk with you about your essay. And this is in the latest Participatio that just came out, what, about a month ago or
Something like that. And you were one of the two editors for it that gathered it and made it happen. So thank you for the part that you played in bringing it all together.
I was, yeah. It was a long project, but we've got some really good essays in it, so I'm
We do indeed.
excited about that. So, and is this the first conversation from this Participatio, or?
No, our first one is somebody by the name of Geordie Zeigler. We had him on before the actual edition was released. He told us it would be out by the end of the month, so we said, okay, we're going to go for it anyway.
Okay.
So it was a great conversation with him, but he was the first. He always leads the way, and so I am second.
All right. Yeah, that was probably one of the best ever in the archives. I'm sure there's thousands of hits. Well, your essay is Thomas F. Torrance and Personalism, Distinctions, Clarifications, and Paths Forward for Christian Anthropology. And could you maybe read your abstract for us? And after you read it, just step back a bit and tell us why this matters to you.
Okay. So this introductory essay intends to begin a process of distinguishing the anthropology of T.F. Torrance from historical forms and definitions of personalism. We will note Torrance's intellectual relationship with some who are referred to as personalists, especially John McMurray and Michael Polanyi. Torrance's theological anthropology, grounded Christologically, was aided by employing their scientific and philosophical insights. Their epistemological and ontological methods assisted in formulating appropriate theological commitments. Having shed light on Torrance's methodology, we are then able to see the way forward for a Trinitarian, scientific, personalistic anthropology. His strategy allows for the development of anthropology deriving from the personalizing person, which then informs a dynamic and relational anthropology. Having established a Christocentric realist starting point, the way is open to follow the Spirit to develop a creative and robust service for the church and a revitalized form of human flourishing. So there's a lot packed in there, obviously, and it's a fairly long essay. But for me, the whole question over the whole course of my studies has been, how do we think about what it means to be persons theologically, so that we're not just defaulting to psychology, which seems to have some problematic elements to it, and to be able to say that theology actually informs the whole nature of what it means to be the church, to be present in all the human services of therapy and counseling, of discipleship, of empowering people for their careers, of empowering artists to be fully persons who bring their personhood to the life of the church. All these things, I think, are susceptible to what it is that Torrance sees with personalism. But there is also this sense that everyone's kind of waiting at the door saying, when are you going to talk about what it means to be real persons? And I'm just going, I think that's what Torrance wants to do for us, but you have to start with him and then proceed beyond it. And so in clarifying the distinction between Torrance's understanding of the person and what I call a personalistic engagement of thinking from personalism, I think it does the work really that Karl Barth did in distinguishing natural theology from theology. They look similar, and you may end up doing a theology of nature, but it's radically different from doing theology through nature. So for me to clarify it is to give us a foundation for all the conversations that then flow from it.
Okay. Well, we'll have some questions as we get into it, but as we start, you start with a introductory parable.
I do.
And I don't want you to recite the parable, but maybe you could tell us the meaning of the parable. Like Jesus's disciples afterwards trying to, tell us what does that mean?
Right.
The rest of your essay actually does that, but in the short version.
It does do that. So the nature of this parable is that there's two contrasting images, and one of them, I mean, the word carnival, in a sense, plays out the whole human fleshliness. So to begin with the flesh, it is in a sense what Karl Barth and T.F. Torrance are doing in all of their critiques that say you're dividing up the world into the flesh and the mind, and you're choosing to go with the flesh, which scientism does that. And so the carnival really represents all the options that humans take in trying to pursue a life of flourishing. There are many different things to attract people at a carnival. Many of them taste good, or they bring wonder to the eyes, but they only last for a day. And so kind of the short-sightedness that T.F. Torrance sees, the language of the illusion, of the nature of human conceiving, which ends up going nowhere because it is only human conceiving that's not really engaging reality. It's not katafusan. So at a carnival, my imaginary Torrance here wanders in and just sees that everything here is illusion and appearance, beginning with what makes sense to humans and the momentary sense of amusement, which I had a friend once who said, you know what amusement means, don't you? I said, what? It's amuse, not thinking. So there's this collapsing kind of into what feels good to me and a kind of feeling that is not necessarily thought through well, but really is quite powerful in the moment to distract us or to give us a sense of escape. And so if our theology and all those things do that, then it's living within this part of the parable of all the ways we try and really distract from the nature of real human engagement. I didn't completely unpack all of John McMurray's work in fear, but fear is this emotive sense that constantly calls forth masks and ways of avoiding. And so the whole of the carnival is a world of avoiding real relationships. The other side of the parable, this teaching research hospital, I have watched a few hospital series like Grey's Anatomy and House MD, which both of them have a teaching hospital element to them, and both of them are very imperfect in the way that the main actors play life out. And yet there is something that one gets in the community that's inspired this sense of what TF really is all about. And that is to be a community of people who are gathering around the reality that is possible by gathering together, not as individuals who are setting up power for one person or the power for the teacher, but that the goodness of what the hospital is all about, in this case, the nature of the theological community, insofar as it really seeks to be attuned to the life of the living Christ, empowered by the Spirit to become those who, with Jesus, become carers, lovers, healers, with Jesus in the world. So all of the images of what he finds have this sense of entering into a community where no one dominates and everyone shares. It's a little bit idealized, I get it, but it gives the sense of what I think Torrance's vision of a proper scientific community looks like, put into the image of a hospital, a research hospital, and a teaching hospital, which you hear that whole sense of the discovery dimension, the heuristic dimension that Torrance gets from Polanyi, and the whole sense that the nature of teaching is what theology should be doing in ways that are corrective and helpful in bringing us back katafusen to the real world, critical realism.
So say a little bit about the patients at the hospital. You say that the patients attempt to conceal the cause of their conditions with lies.
Yeah.
So who are these patients that you're talking about?
Right. Again, if you have you seen House MD?
Probably.
Probably. Okay. So, I mean, the thesis of the whole of the show is that everybody lies, including himself. I mean, he lies about his own addictions, but people come in and they don't want to tell you, where they've been, where they might have gotten, whatever it is. They don't want to reveal their personal life because their symptom of their sickness usually leads to they've been somewhere or doing something with someone or doing something in their own house that they are tempted to conceal.
Mm-hmm.
So to say the nature of even somebody who says, yeah, I know I should go to the hospital, but I don't really trust doctors. There's a sense there they're concealing their own fear of death or their fear of what doctors will do, their own loss of power maybe. And so to say each person that comes in, this is true in the Grey's Anatomy series as well. Each person, one has to really do some significant discovery work to figure out, okay, we've got symptoms here. How do we get at the real source of what's going on? And what does it mean for this person to function and dysfunction and all that? And so it's easy to think of Torrance's work and talking about, words like sin and things like that. And it doesn't invite people don't just going, let's talk about my sin and my brokenness. I mean, it's thank God my sin is covered over, thank goodness for the cross, but let's not actually look at my life and see what that might look like, which may be just the sin of religiosity.
Mm-hmm.
or the sin of pride or something like that. And so the patients in this metaphor are all of those people who Torrance recognizes don't see their own brokenness theologically. They can't see their own sin. And it's something's not functioning well in the world, but they're pretty much in denial about it. And another, one of the major phrases from addiction therapy is that denial is the power of addictions. And that means as long as we can keep hidden what it is we use to cover over our infirmities, our frailness, the things we're afraid to talk about, as long as we're in denial, we're kind of safe. It's a kind of safety that kills us. And so to say the nature of what Torrance wants to do is to say that theology properly understood creates the safe place within which our addictions can be addressed, loved, our true needs can be met, and that is really the work of the church, and an understanding of anthropology that both recognizes our sinfulness and doesn't just see the cross as kind of covering it over. It's not just another mask. It's not another form of denial. It is the venue whereby the Spirit actually engages us and calls us into honesty, connection with other people, so that our healing might happen in that hospital setting.
Say that. What was the quote again? You said from the recovery community: denial is the power of addiction.
Denial is the power of addictions. As long as you're in denial,
right,
you'll be able to continue your addiction and get away with what's going on. And a codependent is somebody who will live within your lie. That's my definition of codependence. Oh, they don't have trouble with drinking. Oh, they don't go to church too much. They just go every once in a while when it's every day and it's taking away from the family. So to live inside of their lie, and again, there's the word lie showing up as a continued answer to your question.
Yeah. So, I mean, I work as a chaplain in the hospital, and in the notes, the way that notes are written, they will say, patient reports that they only drink 2 or 3 times a week. So it's always, there's a very clear sense that they're saying one thing. We don't know if that's true. It's probably more than that. But sorry here.
Yeah. And in marriage counseling, I could put in my notes, patient reports loves their spouse, without wavering.
Right.
Patient reports, yes.
So let's move on to
Symptoms show otherwise.
yes. Yeah, we all want to make ourselves look better than we are.
Right. And
Even
that's
when
the
we're in
lie right
front of the
there.
doctor. Yeah. Even
That's
when
the
we're in
lie.
front of the healer.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So then your next section is, what is the problem? And here I think you're talking about you mean, what is the problem with personalism? Like,
Right. I think that's true. I'm going back and forth between looking at your face. What is the problem? Yeah.
yeah. So I'm on page 72 now.
Yep. Yeah. Torrance's language of lapsing into personalism, which shows up both in his writing as well as in his spoken lectures. He throws this little comment in every once in a while. And the word lapse, obviously shows it's not somewhere that he sees himself going or really anyone else going either.
Well, it lapse to me sounds like a drift, like we just
Yeah.
fall back into that.
Yeah. And
That's the default, is to start with ourselves, kind of.
yeah, which you could say, to lapse into sin is, to say if you're an alcoholic, I'll just have one,
Hmm.
right? Now, I don't believe in book addiction. I think all books are good for the soul, but
Yeah.
there was a day when I recognized coming home that I had purchased at a library book sale a bag of books. This is with my first wife. And she said, "What's in the bag?" And I said, "Oh, just a few books." The next time I came with a bag, I walked a different way around so that she wouldn't see that I had a bag of books. So I came to recognize in and through that the books are not the addiction, right? It's the willingness to want to have what I want. So the books were incidental. It could have been anything. It could have been something to eat. It could have been books. The books are purely incidental in that. It's that I want something for myself, and I don't want anybody to tell me I can't have it. Right.
Hmm.
So part of the power of addiction is just, as I say, whatever you want to hide, there's probably something in there that has become your addiction, but the thing itself is probably not a problem for most people. And it's only a problem for you in the dynamic of that you've come to sacrifice relationships because you have to hide it.
Hmm.
Right. And I think of Adam and Eve hiding in the garden to say, that is the beginning of the loss of humanity and the connection for which we're intended. God comes to restore the honest reconnection by showing up, by allowing them to be who they are, covering them. And so therein begins kind of, what I would call the therapeutic method of, God is committed to the restoring of our desire or need to hide. And it is endemic to our
Hmm.
Adamic problem.
Right.
Right. And I think for Torrance, personalism easily hides a lot of things that we don't want to talk about and just looks at ideals of the good without dealing honestly with the problems.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. So you say there's different personalism versions or different personalist theories. Seems
Right.
like you kind of lump them into two big categories, kind of the idealism version, and then the more, I don't know what the best word, sensation oriented or
If
material
you just
oriented.
think of Torrance's basic dualisms, there's the world of thought and the world of the physical. The personalisms he critiques fall into one or the other of those categories.
Okay. Um, and I mean, you kind of tracking with your paper here. Um, You make up a new word here. You sort of follow in Torrance's feet, and because this is not a Torrance word, right? The personalistic.
No, I am synthesizing the way that Torrance uses the word scientific to say Torrance is against scientism, a reading of the world, the physical world, with a preset vision of the scientist being able to determine what they want to study in science and all that. So they set the agenda in scientism, often called naturalism. And so it doesn't allow for Katafusan kind of thinking. And so to say, if we take personalism, that is again like scientism, a human attempt to organize the world around your key thoughts as a human being. But to be personalistic is the heuristic move to say, there is something here about persons that I will enter into a process of discovery. And this is exactly what Torrance does, particularly in the person of Christ. I think it's Ray Anderson who really took the full sense of the personalizing person out into on being family and on being human, to ask more of the consequent ways of being personalistic in our thinking without collapsing into a personalism.
So the scientism, so that's kind of thinking with a kind of a preset world or framework.
And it's usually
Um,
naturalistic. You know, all the things you get at Halloween, I mean, excuse me, at Valentine's to say, you know, love is just a set of chemicals and situational physical things that our body goes through. Um, there is no such thing as love. So that would be a form of scientism or naturalism. It also, to say Darwinism at some level attempts to explain all of the natural phenomenon of the world in terms of natural processes with no sense of there being any necessary God or intentionality in any of it. It's all cause and effect in a Newtonian kind of way. And so Torrance is going to be critiquing that as a methodological way of functioning.
It makes me think of Alistair McGrath when he tries to, it can feel like wordsmithing, but he talks about a natural theology versus a theology of nature.
Yes. Ray
And,
Anderson wrote an article with that title to it
oh,
once. He did, yeah.
and if I remember the logic right, he was saying that um, that a theology of nature recognizes that nature is not on its own or does not exist by itself.
Yeah.
Um, but a naturalism wants to argue that it does, and so it presumes that it does, and it tries to understand it purely from within itself,
Yes.
and refuses to the possibility of anything beyond, which thinks in one level would say that, I mean, seems consistent for scientists to think that way, but it actually um, by refusing to consider the contingency of nature, then it's very reductive.
Right. Well, refusing is another word for denial. And so once again, we're to what I would call the lie. So to
Right.
say, you are there talking as a human being, all of it should be explained just by natural causes, and we shouldn't talk at all about who you might be as a person, because that can't mean anything, because it's all natural. So to say, if science followed a Polanyi-Torrance methodology, it would say there is a world of Geordie Zeigler as an object, and we can study his age and his weight and his height and all of those things. And that's appropriate to a part of who he is. But if we don't also acknowledge that there's something about the history and dynamic of the personal relationships within which you exist, then we're not being really truthful about doing scientific investigation of all of who Geordie Zeigler is.
Right.
Right. And that would be a more personalistic science. And would we need a community so that there isn't just one person judging Geordie? Do we need to say he is dynamic, and so we need to allow for all the dynamics that appropriately go with that? Absolutely. It's got to be a science that follows Einstein's sense of relativity. All of what we study is going to have a relativity that we have to always be attentive to, but we have to recognize it's there. And if you don't, then you'd say, well, we're going to give you half the truth, and you just have to be satisfied at that. And how good is a half truth?
Right. There are a couple comments in the chat. Tim asks, has Marty's perspective shifted at all between his SJT article and this one? So I'm not sure the title of your Scottish
That was
Journal.
the influence of John McMurray on T.F. Torrance.
Okay.
If it has shifted to be more confident that even, I mean, the thing that McMurray really didn't have was a full Trinitarian vision of all that he did. But he does really believe Jesus is the one who reveals the nature of personhood. So, as I said, actually, in my doctorate back in 1982, John Zizioulas is, in a sense, the theologian, but he acts like a philosopher. And John McMurray is really a philosopher who acts like a theologian. And it's particularly on this question of the nature of what it means to be persons, and saying, by our own natural reading, we will not come up with what we get when we listen to Jesus as the one who gives us the basic framework within that. So, since writing the article, I still believe that T.F. Torrance read, understood, valued what it is that McMurray brought. And that McMurray is the one, he every once in a while says, maybe the social sciences will figure out what it is that the sciences like Michael Polanyi have figured out. And he said the one who is the closest to being the genius, in a sense, that McMurray is Michael Polanyi. So he had Polanyi a step or two behind McMurray in insight in the realm of the social knowledge of human beings. So I have, if anything, I've just become more convinced that McMurray's influence is not incidental, and that it's quite profound in all of the language of personalizing person and all that, that he wouldn't and couldn't have said those and meant what he did mean without McMurray providing the language and framework that he gave to him.
Yeah. I want to get to Polanyi and McMurray, but I want to kind of do it in the order of
Daily
your...
Examine, Bryden's got two that I just want to acknowledge. Yeah. There is a sense of daily examine that's appropriate. One has to ask, where do I stand in that examine? Right. And so there's the whole sense of learning the life of submission and humility, in a sense, in that in all of the traditions of spiritual formation, it is easy to read in traditions. All of them have the possibility of being done well in the context of what it is the Torrance doing, and then they become very fruitful. Geordie is one of the few, I think, that I know that's I would say has done the real work of thinking through T.F. Torrance to get to spiritual formation. But I think there's a lot of fruitfulness that is still yet to be unfolded from all of that.
Thanks.
Yeah, Alistair McGrath and the Nature of the Trilogy, Scientific Theology. I have not read the trilogy, so I can't speak too much of that. Polanyi, it's more than just his faith and society. Personal knowledge was certainly influential for Torrance, and does engage questions of the nature of person, as well as what role the person plays in science generally. The faith and science is certainly an important piece in that.
I throw in that very early book of Polanyi's because he does two things at once. First of all, it is a community of scientists.
Yes.
It is never a scientist on his own, either synchronically or diachronically. You build on this community and tradition. And secondly, the plausibility structures of that community are such that it enables them to go forward.
Yeah.
So that the faith element of science is brought explicitly to the fore. And he even compares the community of scientists with the Catholic Church. Yeah. And it's a kind of a fascinating play with T with a capital tradition. This organic, ongoing, growing, Catholic in a Protestant sense. The kataholos. And I think that element seems to drop out of his work a little, perhaps. I'm not quite sure why, but it does. And I think it needs a real, prominence.
Yeah, there's a lot to be done with Polanyi's work. I agree. In my parable in the beginning, the hospital setting there, that in a sense is bringing Torrance into Polanyi's community. the community of scientists there is it's a medical community, but I was envisioning Polanyi's Society of Explorers in that parable.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, cool. And just back to Alistair's trilogy. There are two versions of it. One runs to 1,200 pages, 3 volumes. The other is about 240 pages. It's a paperback, an introduction to a scientific theology. It's a kind of what he would call a noddy guide. And I mean, I recommend it to just about anybody I can sort of say, hey, this is very much an entree to his work. Beautiful piece of writing.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. The one other thing I forgot to say, and this, this comes for Bruce a bit here. The field concepts of Maxwell are paralleled in McMurray's The Field of the Personal, which ends his Gifford lectures. And so to say the Maxwell McMurray jump there into seeing more fully that the work that Maxwell had done, that Einstein picked up, that McMurray is really the one who I have best seen really articulate the field of the personal in a way that Buber didn't. Buber's I and thou with the between is between persons, but he doesn't take it to the level of a field. That was really McMurray's work. And so to say it's McMurray is taking Maxwell up to another level, into another dimension, to give further insight into the whole field that for Torrance then becomes part of his understanding of what's going on here in what I'm laying out as a personalistic science.
Well, I have a lot of questions related to McMurray and Polanyi,
Okay.
but I kind of want to just bring us up to speed in your essay to that point so that we have it in context.
Yeah.
So in your next section, you're talking about what is personalism, and you list about 5 different commonalities of personalism, which
Yep. The basics.
Yeah, and would you say that for the most part, these are things that Trinitarian Christians would want to agree with? It's more the grounding of them. Is that the problem, or
Well, it's like saying, as a gardener, do you want picked flowers or flowers that grow? I mean, do you want them to be cut off, or do you want them to be, nurtured and grow? And it is almost as stark as that for Torrance. So to say all forms of personalism focus on the human, so the human here has become central, plucked by one's imagination as to what's important. And so it can be any one of a variety of different aspects, like love or freedom or justice, where somebody says, I'm a personalist and justice is my issue, and everything becomes about envisioning what just humans look like, and everything collapses into a social justice paradigm that Torrance would go, what happened to persons here? Everything has turned out to be plucked out and cut into this one form of the conversation. So to say they're not slight moves for Torrance, they are radical disembodiments from real humanity into ideas that end up taking over, and they feel like something that's so important to the one who's proposing them, and even the people who hear about it, that they can't see that it's been selected out, and that in its selectivity it's been taken out of context, and it's generally lost its theological roots.
And that's probably your last line is probably the biggest the critique of all of them, right? They've all lost theological roots.
Which is, like I say, that's like having, do you like flowers to put into your vase that last for a week? Or do you want plants that you plant in the garden and they live and last for a lifetime?
Which is interesting because how we get somewhere really matters, doesn't it? Because easily people can say, oh, well, we agree that everyone has dignity, and so let's go from there. But how we got there matters.
Totally true. Yeah, and this has been a many decade journey to get to this article, to figure out that the importance of what you just said. That all of these things are good in and of themselves, in a sense, But if you select them out, it's like taking one part of your spouse and saying, I love your smile, or, as often happens, I love your sex, but we don't pay attention to the rest. And when that part disappoints, everything falls apart because we narrow and reduce to what we really like, and we don't recognize we're actually losing the other person.
Mm.
That's powerful. Yeah.
Which there was this is a slightly different study, but it makes the point. There was a study done, a 3-year study of newlyweds and roommates, to see how well they thought they knew the other person and how much they actually knew the person over the course of 3 years. And they found out that the confidence that in both the case of the roommate and the newlyweds, they felt like they knew the other person after 3 years, almost impeccably. But the actual amount that they had went increasingly down. So confidence up, actuality down, which means there is this sense that if you don't have regular conversations, you will inevitably drift to a greater confidence of knowing something with less and less actual reality, to the point that they become merely a shadow that you relate to. And they end up in my office space somewhere along that line saying, I don't know where I lost this person, I don't know who they are anymore. It's like, yep, you stopped having the conversation of knowing, which that is Torrance's katafusin. You lost katafusin in your relationship, and therefore you drifted away from each other because other factors come in, and you keep growing and changing, but you lost touch. And that happens in people's spiritual life too, right? And this is where daily examine, if it is done in such a way that we truly reconnect with who God is and who we are in that context, it can be a connecting thing. Or we can end up with an idea of God and not pay attention to all the things that we turn our blind eye to because they're inconvenient.
Yeah. That's very true. I mean, both those images, I love your word shadow, I think is a key word, and just, it's very visual to imagine a flower cut from the stem, and yet are realizing we can throw all that at the personalists, but we can have that same way of relating to God in our own spiritual life. We can live kind of in a cut off version, a shadow version that's not actually engaging with the God who's here with us.
Yeah. The field of the personal includes humans as well as divine persons. And we really have not done the kind of work I think that could be done about thinking about what it means to live in the field of relations of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. To ask, when somebody comes and sits down in church, just for what should be a really overt place, so where is the Father here? And generally speaking, people, they say, well, what do you mean? Well, is the Father here today with us? The one who Jesus brings to us? I don't know. I've never thought about it really. And there just isn't a sense that we live in the field of the Father's loving embrace when we come to worship. Much less they walk out the door and the Father, unless they're singing, "This is my Father's world," which I think is an attempt to attune to that, it's very easy to forget that we live in the field of the loving embrace of the Father, and that might shape our daily existence. And if I ask him, so what do you think Jesus thinks about you sitting here today, again, thinking in church? Most people say, I'm not sure. Or he's glad I'm here. Or, some general thing. It's like, do you believe that Jesus is actually here and sees you and is actually thinking about you and engaged with you? And most people they don't think at that interpersonal level that he is the personal presence who knows, loves, and addresses me. And then we come to church, hopefully to hear his word through the written word in such a way that we walk out going, I heard the voice of Jesus today. I don't know who that other person was, who he used, but I know Jesus spoke to me today. And there are those days where you go, that sermon was for me. God used that preacher to speak to me. And I go, okay, now you're beginning to live into what I would call here in Torrancean terms, the field of the personal. The personalizing person got to you. And you were receptive by the Spirit to hear that word spoken to you.
Yeah, that's really good. I think from a just being human standpoint, it's so much easier to generalize. I mean, like there's I was talking to some people recently about, we talk about our marriage as if our marriage is a thing.
Yeah.
I want to work on my marriage. And we talk about this generalized abstract thing when what actually matters is the person we're sleeping next to.
Yeah.
So that has a name and that has good days and bad days and when we're in church or when we're in prayer, it's very easy just to kind of live in ambiguity or generality or vague shadows, and it takes some work, and I don't know. I mean, there's a challenge here with how much work should people be taking in terms of direct dialogue with God, and is it important that people do the work of distinguishing direct dialogue with the Father and the Son and the Spirit, or how do they have direct dialogue with the threeness, and just like the directness of that, living in the field, as you said, of the Father's loving embrace. I mean, that is um, it takes a different kind of intentionality that is work.
Yeah. Well, it may be. I mean, do you know that your wife loves you right now?
By faith.
By faith?
I mean, I do, but she's not in the room. She's not in the
She's not in
house.
the room. Right. And that's sometimes I have people say, to say the word I'm close to you sitting in a theater is a true physical statement. I have no idea who you are, but I'm close to you. Whereas somebody may be on the other side of the world. When I was in New Zealand, there were people who I was close to, they were far, far away, but the word I am close to you was a relational concept. And it was just as true, if not truer, that I am close to you sitting physically next to you. And so this is both Bart and Torrance make much of space and time. And one of the things they're trying to break us out of is if somebody's in the other room, space and time would say, as persons, that doesn't matter. Because the field of the personal includes all of it, right? We become physically oriented. That's personalism in the physical aspect. I'm close to this person when I'm with them. So I think that you're right. It does take some work, but it may be very simple work. The possibility in the morning to say, every morning, dear, I'm going to sit down with you and just say, I knew you yesterday. I'm not sure what you're up to today or how you feel about today. Give me a quick rundown. Well, I'm going to see this person. I'm a little bit afraid of them, and I'm really excited to do this event. Awesome. And so at the end of the day, to say, so how did it go? How did that meeting go? Well, I was a little disappointed because whether or not the content of what they said is important, you are on the same page. You are close. You are knowing and being known. And literally, it could be, and this is my great metaphor, it could be literally take as much time as brushing your teeth. And when people say, brushing my teeth takes too much time, flossing, you want me to floss too? And my wife says, you don't have to floss, or if you floss, just floss the teeth you want to keep.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking we just need to be as creative as dentistry has been to say there are simple practices that we can do in our personal human relationships and in our divine relationships that are as effective as brushing our teeth, flossing our teeth, taking a shower. There is the classic of, the couple where the wife says, do you love me, honey? And he says, of course I love you. I told you the day we got married, if I change my mind, I'll let you know. And many people live with that kind of, assuming on the other that I haven't changed my mind. But of course, in the not conversing, in the not dialoguing, what one might call the lifeblood of relationship gets lost. And this is where what you just talked about is the particularity, not abstracting, of marriage or any of these things becomes so important. It's important for Polanyi, it's important for Torrance that we have to be willing to get very particular in our study, or we will generalize, and probably the generalization will become a mask for what's actually going on, and we won't see what's actually going on. So the nature of the personalistic way that I think Torrance wants us to engage requires a great attentiveness to the person or persons with whom we relate, and to discover what does it look like to pay attention to the particularity, lest it become abstract and it becomes the graft. We end up with an abstraction. Yes, they're my spouse. Yes, they've been with me X number of years. But you've lost touch. You've lost the connection that one might call faith. And this is, again, faith-seeking understanding. Personalistic thinking is faith seeking to understand the other. I married you, Sharon. This is you, not me. But I never want to take that for granted. I want to continue to be in a discovering mode with you so that every day I both know who you've been, but I'm also open to who you are each day as we grow together.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that the last day that we spend together is the day that we know each other the deepest.
You used a sentence, I wish I could get you to repeat it, but it had the word personalistic in it.
Yes. Well, the good thing is this is being recorded, so
Cheers, yeah. But I think part of what I'm hearing, which I think is significant, is that if we're not intentional about being particular,
yes,
then we will generalize. And when we generalize, we actually live in the impersonal.
yeah. And when you start seeing that, Torrance says it all over the place in different language. And it's, he uses the language of generalization, abstraction. Those are two key words that he does, but he's moving us away from all the ways we try and do science that hasn't paid attention. And when you deal with persons, you have to pay all the more because of the dynamic nature of persons. Rocks, they're very slow to change unless you hit them with something very large. But persons, you can be attuned to there and know them quite well. And the end policies of our eternal life is that now we know in part, and it's a kind of particular, but it's a very narrow particular, but then we will know as we have been fully known. God already knows us, every aspect of us completely in its particularity. I mean, I think that's part of what the alreadiness of the knowing of God is to us. And so as we come to dwell within knowing that we have been known, now you don't just, in a sense, think of God as the field of some presence, but it's a person who knows every aspect of my thinking, feeling, behaving every single day. And he's already attuned to all those things. So I can enter into that and say, so Jesus, I'm wrestling with this. Help me to think about this. Spirit, guide me on this issue because I know you're already thinking about me in this. Help me to find the way that I align with the nature of the reality of your love, so that I, in fact, am being transformed into the image of the one that created me. Colossians has a lot of, I think, the language of this being brought to the particularity that aligns with the nature and character of Christ.
It's good. Yeah, personalistic knowing is the way of communion.
It is. And oh, how I wish that we could do a better job of not just repeating a set of words that we kind of end up saying, here we go again, we're just saying the words, but that we really bring a sense. Now, you may have had communion 1,000 times before, but today, stop and recognize the living Jesus is coming to be with you today. And as we come to this bread and this wine, we're not just going through something that is a pointer to something that's far away. It is a participation in the very presence and life of Jesus that is here to affirm to you, for you I died, for you I am risen, for you I will come again. So come, and as the person you are, know that Jesus meets you particularly and lovingly and embracingly in this meal on this day. And that's getting over the generalization that so often comes, and taking what is a general thing. We do the Eucharist, but to make it truly particular for this day so that it has all of the meaning of this particular day. I see Dwayne's hand up there.
Oh,
Yeah.
how are you guys doing? I
Morning.
just wanted to mention what you're saying there, Marty. I look at that movie Groundhog Day, if you've ever seen it.
Yes.
He's so self-absorbed, but the whole meaning of his life is to live just that one day right. And all of a sudden his world opens up to the possibility of you can intervene, recognize where that other person is at, and it makes you much more aware of how you're all interconnected. And you find
Wow.
at the end of your day, it's a far better day when you've connected. And you know, living with your wife or living with your children is exactly like that, because we need mediation to, because everybody's unique, so we don't know how to express our uniqueness, and we don't know how to respond appropriately to the uniqueness. So
Yeah,
the fact that Jesus became man actually helps us, because we got one who
absolutely.
knows to divide between soul and spirit.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, I think. And
Marty, oh, go ahead.
I just want to say before I lost it there. So I said that Jesus has the ability to read people's minds, and know what they're thinking. And he knew what they were thinking is a phrase that comes up. We can have the same thing, but we have to use one small tool, and it's called asking questions. We can know what people are thinking, but we have to be willing to ask. And to not ask is to not engage and to not know and to live with the myth that we know or that we don't care, and hence drift away. Go ahead,
Mm.
Geordie.
I'd love to hear you say a little more about Martin Luther King and personalism. I don't know how much you've explored of his background with that, but you
Yeah.
brought him into the conversation. So
Yeah, well, he's one of the most, next to Martin Buber, maybe he's one of the most famous personalists in a sense, though people don't often attach the name personalism to him. But to say there's something about what became the civil rights movement that wasn't initially just about civil rights. It was a reading of the gospel that values the nature of all persons, of all races, of all colors. And he saw that in scripture, that the nature of what he saw ultimately is every child, black, white, and any color playing together. For him, that was a biblical vision. And so there is a sense in which those personalists who he studied under at Boston University, they gave him a vision of reading scripture, of reading the current time in which he lived, and to call for a kind of justice that had a biblical kind of mandate behind it. And so that's part of the power that made Martin Luther King Jr. great, though he isn't always, people do say reverend, but I don't know if they stop and think about it. So Martin Luther King Jr. is one who I'd say he took what we would say are the best possible outcomes of personalism, and he maintained a fidelity to the Bible, which keeps him closer to Torrance than not, in a sense. But he still has a sense that human rights are human rights, and that it's not that he doesn't build all of his logic out of the life of the Trinity, the person of Jesus. He doesn't build from all that, but he does build in the nature, the generalized nature, to go to your phrase, the generalized nature of the value of human beings of all races and colors and ages. And so he is one who would say he's getting enough right that you can see we can't throw out personalism, because when you do it with a biblical mandate and attempt to align to what it is God's doing, good outcomes will come. But the nature of doing a science of the personal that really works out of the person of Christ in the way T.F. Torrance would do it, he didn't go in that direction. Do we criticize him for that? No, we say he moved in the right direction, but Torrance would say you still defaulted to human values, human ideals. And as long as you do that, other people are going to say, well, Martin Luther King did it for blacks and whites, and what are we going to do it for? And they're going to choose other groups of people, and they're going to start putting out their agenda, the Martin Luther King agenda of we need to fight for the rights of, and some of them we'd say we have questions, and some of them we would say are questionable.
Hmm.
Right. And so once you
Yeah.
adopt a position, a generalized position, then you become vulnerable to all kinds of things. So
Of course, you can see the political expediency of not grounding it in Christology, because if you're American politics, you're trying to get everybody on your team. As soon as you say that, this position works because of Jesus, you suddenly create a problem for people that don't buy into Jesus. And so that, I could see for a public person trying to gather as large a group as possible, that becomes a challenge for how clear are you, even if it is your grounding, how clear are you in putting it out there to to the masses. And
J.B. Torrance, whether he is visiting Ireland or South Africa or the south of the United States or India or wherever he would go, he would always say, my job is to acknowledge that Jesus has granted each of these persons their dignity, and I show up as one who also grants that person laying in their own filth in the street their dignity, seeing them through the eyes of Jesus to give them their personhood, their human dignity. And so in his own particular person, he was living it in every context as a stand against the political norms of that conflictual situation. He wasn't rising up to battle, though he did with de Klerk and others, take them on and say, you say you're a Christian, what about the Jesus who loves? And, he would talk about the people who de Klerk had been abusing and call them into a different way of thinking and functioning. And he'd gather the Protestant and Catholic churches that were on either side of a wall in Belfast and talk about the gospel and what Jesus does, and seeing each other through the eyes of Jesus and not through their own politicized eyes. So I think J.B. Torrance, for me, in many ways, moves towards embodying it, but he doesn't try and take it on at the level of the power of the politician necessarily. And that's where we go with U2's October. Kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall, but you go on and on and on, right? So we stand with the confidence that in our being a J.B. Torrance, or even being a Martin Luther King Jr., with the particular people that are in front of us, we are doing the work of participating in the kingdom. Bryden had his hand up there. I don't want you to lose that thought, Bryden, if you still have it.
Oh, I just wrote 2 notes there earlier on. The immediacy of the thing that is not Groundhog Day. If we're attuned to the Greek East's epiclesis as an integral part of the history of the tradition of the Eucharist, then communion becomes profoundly Trinitarian and communion. Secondly, that CRT business, I mean, critical race theory, which is, pretty basic, I think, for much of American politics at the moment, and also interestingly for us too in New Zealand, although it's not called that here yet. These are just, a subspecies for me of Marxism. And it's profoundly racist. I mean, CRT is incredibly racist.
So say we need the work of theologians to unpack it theologically so that we can see the nature.
Correct.
Otherwise, you just stand in another political place attacking another political position. So it's where the gospel really helps us to value the whole.
All you get is polarization.
Yeah.
Radical polarization.
Which seems to be symptomatic of something that's breaking things apart. Then it's probably not gospel, right? The Spirit of the Lord has upon me. He's anointed me too, and it's breaking down walls and setting prisoners free. And so I think we have some of the signs of what a good personalistic way of thinking is, even engaging politics, that moves in the right direction, and others that don't.
Well, let's we haven't even gotten to your Polanyi and McMurray yet, and
we can be there if you want. All you have to do is you get to guide the conversations.
Okay. Well, next part you're going to talk about how does Torrance correct the problem. You talk about his Christocentric anthropology of persons, Jesus as a personalizing person, onto a relational being in that sense, which I think those are not the unique things in your paper. I think those are your unless you would say you're saying something different than others.
They're not unique for somebody who reads Torrance all the time necessarily, though the nature of what we think of when we use the word person, it's so easy to think human, person, individual are all the same thing. And so to say that the personalizing person if we think of Jesus as an individual who makes you as an individual more of a person, then we've missed the dimension of what personalizing does there. So the nature of who we are by virtue of the personalizing person is we are also brought into context with other persons. So if you're sitting in a church and you say, Jesus, make me more of a person, and so he gives you this warm love in your heart for Jesus, but you neither look at nor ask questions of nor touch the people sitting next to you, it's like you're not getting the personalizing person here. This personalizing person gives you eyes to see those who are next to you as well, both those who are kind to you as well as those who are not, and asks, what does it mean to be the person Jesus is making me to be in on this day in this place? And the other thing is just the personalizing person in terms of the judgments we have on ourselves. I think it's easy for people to say, yeah, Jesus, made me more of a person, but they don't do any of the work on recognizing their own prejudices, their own wounds, their own hurts. They haven't done the loving thing of just coming to understand themselves in the context of their story as they've told it to themselves or been told it by their others, and to allow Jesus to do a healing work in and through that story. And until you do that, the personalizing person has only barely begun to impact us.
Hmm. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg?
Jesus.
So yeah, I mean, as we experience Jesus doing that with us, then we would join him in doing that toward others, or do we see the other and begin to seek to be that way? And as we are that way, we discover there's a connection to that's the way that Jesus is, and it comes back to us.
Well, the very last section is we don't say that's the way Jesus is. That's the theorist model. But
Right.
the question of the ordering, it's always Jesus first, and Jesus speaks a word to us. And the word isn't just a general word, I love you. It's I love you through that story with your dad and what was missing with him. I love that you endured and that you didn't give up on caring. I love that you could let that be a wound, but you choose to see it giving you an energy to love more your dad and other people who are like him. And I mean, there's a working out here of the healing of Jesus, who takes on our particular story and what could be painful within it and redeems it and makes it whole so that we become whole persons.
So say that a little more. So Jesus is always first.
Jesus is always first. And Jesus doesn't just engage us with an abstract love, right? I mean, it's Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so, which Gary Detto, says we need to change it. Jesus loves me, this I know, so the Bible tells me so, which is a little bit better. It makes it more of a factual thing rather than just my experience of it. But to say that if we make Jesus' love for us just an abstract thing, it's not going to penetrate into any of the actualities of our life, the pains, the hurts, the joys, the possibilities. It's just an abstract love, and it hasn't penetrated into where it needs to go to do all of the restoring work that the ministry of Jesus is about, as he talks about it in his first sermon on Isaiah 61.
Mm-hmm.
There is this profound sense in which the love of Jesus penetrates into each particular person in a way that makes them more able to shed the things that have caused pain and fear, insofar as it stops them. We don't forget them, but we learn to see them anew and afresh because of the Jesus who shows up there, so that they don't become triggers of our pain that then download on other people. Which that's a lot of work in counseling is, why do we go back to their family of origin? Because there's a lot of pain that is still carried over, and anybody who looks or feels like that, it triggers them, and so they get resistant and angry, and because it's all still there. And so the personalizing Jesus sees all that and wants to engage all of it. He wants to see us made whole,
Mm-hmm.
and to have a perfect love that casts out fear. Bryden.
Geordie's chicken and egg I've been thinking about for the last 4 or 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Often I think, Geordie, we think we need to let him do stuff with us, and it's fairly individualistic, when often Jesus will actually use the very person that we think is the person that we should be ministering to, as in fact the minister to us. And I've seen this time and time again in a parish setting, where setting up a small group suddenly becomes a laboratory for healing in ways that are so unexpected, because the vulnerable in that group become, in fact, the ministers of healing for the stronger ones, in inverted commas. And the chicken and the egg is delightful to ponder, because it's extraordinary how often the very person we least expect becomes the minister of Christ to us, if we let it. And I find that intriguing, because it exposes my pride. It makes me a little bit more humble, perhaps, a little bit more vulnerable, a little bit more open. And that can't be bad. That can't be bad.
Yeah. There's
Anyway,
a phrase that
thank you for your
Bryden
chicken
had.
and egg.
There's a chicken egg phrase that Bryden has that I've been thinking about for weeks now, and that is the idea of cultivating receptivity.
Oh gosh, help.
Right?
Yes.
The sense in which was a Jesus is first, but in the parable of the seed and the sower, there's something about the ground that matters. Does the seed begin it? No. Is there a sower? Yes. Does it matter about the ground? Probably so. So part of that, I think, is also the receptivity part. Says there is a first, that is the sower and the seed. But there are things in our pasts, in our attitudes, in the story we tell ourselves and others, that make for hard ground. Right?
Yep.
And so,
Thank you.
So it is, again, we'll say it's not a chicken and egg scenario. There is a sequencing that were there not seeds and were there not a sower, the parable wouldn't work very well. But there is a receptivity that the parable wants to expose us to, and that is Jesus is the sower, and he brings the seed of his life and his love. We can be hardened to it, in a sense, and not let it in. And it will be our fears and our pain that blocks the reality of what is there. Torrance's Katafusan says, when you can recognize the nature of the Jesus who is there and the seed that he plants, even the knowing it is there can soften up the ground. But we have to, in a sense, be receptive to that. That's where you're cultivating receptivity. The word cultivating, of course, has very nice carryovers into seed and sower metaphors as well. So to say spiritual formation at some level isn't as teaching to do things as it is becoming aware of what stops the Son, the Father, the Spirit from doing their work, and allowing for that to be done is the cultivating of receptivity.
Yeah.
And that is also the personalizing person doing the particular speaking to us that we might hear and be changed because of it.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Lovely.
That's really good. Yeah. I think the big word for me for the last year on this has been consent. That's when we giving our consent to God's activity in any particular moment.
Yeah.
And I love that what Bryce was saying about it's often in the other. It's not just me as the vessel of Jesus, but openness to how Jesus is speaking to me through the other as the minister, and which that's a good twist on the initiative. Yeah.
Consent and content. I mean, I just think of Paul, and I've learned to be content. I mean, there is a choice on his part to consent to better for worse, richer for poor. I mean, to use marriage kind of language, there is a sense that it's yielding, isn't it? Which I often think, our call is to yield to the work of the Spirit, and consent is another word, I think, for that. So I think it's a good word to be thinking through. And contentment, as Paul envisions it, is in a sense that consent to accept that whatever is going on is God's work and not mine.
Well, good. Well, let's turn to your Torrance sanctioned personalists, Polanyi and McMurray.
Murray, yes.
Both Christians, right?
Yes, in different kinds of ways, but yes. McMurray was a Quaker, and Polanyi grew up in Hungary, so he had Orthodox kind of roots growing up in Hungary. So relatively, high church versus quite low church, Quaker, but in both influenced by the nature of those faith communities.
Could you read for us your final paragraph on Polanyi? This is page 88 I'm looking at. You say it's his concluding statement in Personal Knowledge.
It is.
You quote it, and then you follow it up by saying he could stand before God but not take us to know God. So could you maybe read that quote and kind of unpack that?
Yeah. Torrance found in Polanyi a scientist who developed and employed tools to be scientific and personally engaged with the whole of reality without dualistic lenses. Polanyi could stand before God, that's what he says in the quote, but not take us to know God.
Yeah. So can you read it? Does the quote help us with that or not?
Sure. We may envision then a cosmic field which called forth all these centers, that is, these individual human centers. He still maintains this kind of individualism in his thinking by offering them a short-lived, limited, hazardous opportunity for making some progress of their own towards an unthinkable consummation. And that is also, I believe, how a Christian is placed when worshiping God. Now, a Christian, I mean, he never quite breaks out of the individual with their thinking center. They volunteer to be part of the community of explorers as scientists, but they do it with this center of thought that is separate from the others. And so to say he doesn't take us where McMurray does in terms of the nature of being personally interrelated in our very constitution in being. The other thing is McMurray was very big on the nature of emotion, and that reason is really highly developed emotion. Whereas for Polanyi, he still keeps reason always the center of what it means to be human, and never really deals with the nature of emotion in the human experience. And so if in fact the nature of what it means to be persons is emotive, we have motives, we act in the world, and our acts are interrelated with other people's activities and ways of being, that we come to develop love for particular persons who shape how we come to discern the world, how we come to discern others, how we come to discern ourselves. Then so much of the shaping of another human being and my own self is ground into us with this engagement with other persons. And Polanyi at the very end with the Christian is standing before God as this center of thought with a kind of a sense of openness, but he doesn't really have Jesus standing there, which for McMurray, Jesus is the other who showed us what it meant to be persons. That the clue to history is Jesus, that his 1937 book.
Right.
The clue to history is that Jesus came and showed us that we don't just live as human beings out of fear, which he shows the nature of how that developed Greek and Roman culture, but that Hebrew culture was distinct in that God spoke to a people and said, "You are mine," and the people listened. This is Torrance's whole thing of the listening instead of observing that he sees in Greek and Roman culture. And so Polanyi, he never quite breaks out of the Greco-Roman mindset of what science is doing, even though he came to recognize that it is human beings who are doing the scientific work. So the epistemology of Polanyi moved past the breaking up everything into parts in a sense. He followed Einstein in seeing kind of the relativity of all things. and there's a human person observing as a scientist, but he didn't get all the way to seeing that human persons themselves are persons by virtue of their being in relationship.
Hmm.
So he didn't get to the ontology. He got the epistemology, but he didn't get all the way to the ontology.
Hmm. Is that so? If you were to say, what did Torrance love about Polanyi? It would be focused on the epistemological.
That's right. His definition of indwelling. Indwelling is an epistemological move where you come to indwell something. But Polanyi never used that to indwell the nature of another person. He indwelt the scientific research, the world of science with that, but he didn't use it. And even Andrew Grosso, in his book on personal being, said, in a sense, you could say that Polanyi just never gave us an anthropology. He never really told us what a person was. But when he did, he had societies of individuals who were working with an investigative mind to do, in a sense, a kind of a katafusen of the physical world in the same way that Einstein did. Though Einstein has, funny little quotes and things like that that make you think that Einstein thought more about persons maybe than Polanyi did.
Hmm.
Which, I mean, some of them are just the humorous ones, like gravity is not to be blamed for people falling in love. He recognized the physical world there, but he also recognizes there is another category, and that is people falling in love. And the fact that Einstein said that, it's like he's hinting there's another paradigm, and I'm not going to pay attention to it here, but it's there, right? And Polanyi just kind of he never quite got to that. So to say Polanyi gave Torrance the idea, the recognition that science cannot be impersonal in the way that it thinks it is. So it's living with its own lie. It wants power and control over its knowledge. And so it says, we're going to be objective. No personal involvement here. And Polanyi said, what are you talking about? Every observation you make, every judgment you make on that observation, every report you write out on it, and every reading of those reports are all persons involved in that process. So epistemologically, if we're going to be honest, we've got to recognize the person is epistemologically involved in everything. And what that does is it opens the door for McMurray's work, where you can then go on to say, can we do that with persons as well? Yeah, if we're going to be good scientists, we have to. We're compelled to, because it's part of what we discover, that persons aren't just bodies with physical brains, they're brains that function. And so we have to explore the nature of the functioning and dysfunctioning of the brain in a way that's true to the nature of that.
So do you know the dates of Polanyi and McMurray? And I mean, Torrance, we know, was born in what, 2000, I want to say 13.
I'm trying to remember their birthday. They both died in 1976. I'm trying to think if they died on the same day. Polanyi was supposed to write a commendation in the same way that Torrance did for being knighted in the UK, but I have a letter from Polanyi's wife saying he is too sick to write this letter. This was written towards the end of 75. It was, yeah, that's right. It was 76, 75, saying, he would write it, but he's too sick and won't be able to. I've had many debates with McMurray Society people and the Polanyi Society saying, they had nothing to do with each other and hardly knew each other. But the fact that he was asked to write a letter of commendation to be knighted, and he said, I would do, my husband would do it, but he's too sick, and in fact died at about the same time, says there was a relationship. They did recognize each other. There's another quote I haven't been able to find in a book. I found it once, and I've lost where it is, where somebody talked to McMurray and said, did you ever talk to McMurray, or did you ever talk? It was McMurray is talking. Did you ever talk to Polanyi? No, I did not. We were aware of one another, but we were both kind of mavericks, and we were afraid that each of us would just throw the other person off in the world rather than being a help and a support. So we maintained a respectful distance.
Wow.
So they're aware of each other's work, but
They're literally
they didn't build.
So, I mean, they're literally 1 month apart from each other. Both born in 1891.
They were born the same year and died the same year. I think, yeah,
Wow.
their lifetimes are incredibly close. And
Wow.
against James Houston, who lived 2 doors down from Michael Polanyi at Oxford, who said he had many conversations with Michael Polanyi. And one day, this is actually, I haven't found it in one of the Regent tapes. He actually has it on it in one of his lectures that I need to find. Michael Polanyi came in and says, "Have you read this?" What is it? And it was John McMurray. And this is Michael Polanyi taking, and it was one of Polanyi's or McMurray's works in the 30s, likely Reason and Emotion or Interpreting the Universe. And it's really much of the paradigm that Polanyi went on to develop about the nature of scientific investigation. So again, I've yet to fully convince the Polanyi Society that McMurray was influential there, but Torrance himself and Jim Houston are two people who just lead me to conclude these are not separated people. Torrance drew on them both, but they're part of a milieu of thought that was brilliant. Torrance himself, in that article in honor or writing for McMurray to be knighted, said he was a savant 50 years ahead of the rest of us. Now, he may have just pulled the number 50 down. And who is we? Who is the we that he saw in this? And I think it was Polanyi and himself were at least two who are included in that we. The McMurray's work was 50 years ahead of them.
Hmm.
And that in reading McMurray, both Polanyi and Torrance found insights that helped them to go on and do things that were beyond McMurray. And so just to say they were part of a community of people who themselves were unveiling for each other things that each was able to develop in its own kind of way.
So talk us through your paths for realigning theological thinking in light of these guys. This is page 90. This is your constructive part, I think.
This is constructive. So the whole nature of, and again, the word perichoresis is this mutual indwelling, the nature of what it means to know and to know that we are known, and to say so much of what we do in theology, as well as in churches, as well as even in therapy, assumes the individual. The basis of modern psychology assumes the individual with thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. If there is a path forward to realign thinking for therapeutic ends, it will be because we reposition ourselves as to what we mean by a person. And so personalism just selects aspects that are not helpful, including in psychology, to really get at what it looks like to be healthy. And psychology also was largely developed out of pathologies, the things that go wrong. And so if you study the DSM-5, you're studying disorders. So the nature of theological thinking with therapeutic ends says there's something about what it is that we're created to be as persons who live in a full relationship with Father, Son, Spirit, with a community of people who we might call the church, who function as a functional family and not as a dysfunctional family, which is a paper I wrote back in 1989, The Church is a Dysfunctional Family. And to recognize theology should be doing a better job at helping churches to be functional families with the Father, Son, Spirit as those who shape the very culture and life of the family. A family system, according to Bowen, who was a family systems therapist, he's kind of a personalist, but to say a family is an emotional unit is to say everyone is interconnected. And so the word field here comes into play. And the dominant emotional connection for a family is anxiety or fear. It comes as we learn to not want to offend, hurt, disappoint, or whatever the other. Anxiety is what keeps us aligned in a way that is not truly open to ourselves. And so to be realigned out of being those who with God, which again, many people in pulpits make people afraid of God so that they'll be good and afraid of God's judgment. But to say even a good pastor who people don't want to disappoint ends up bringing their authority in such a way that it's a means of controlling people, not people don't want to be disappointing the pastor or the leadership or something. And so the aligning of an emotional system in a church, even though we come on Sundays to worship God, the alignment is around the emotion of who's in power here. Is it the pastor? Is it the elders? Is it the person who gives the most money? And am I going to really let people know what I think? And when I suggest to people, what if you just stop halfway through the sermon and just talk to the person next to you about how whatever's being said hits you? It's like, oh, the people wouldn't like that. And I just go, okay, that's fear. So the fear of people not liking is going to keep us from talking with one another. So we're basically aligning around our fear. So to say, if we realign around who Jesus is, we're going to create contexts where being honest with one another, loving and accepting each other as Jesus loves and accepts us, is going to be just not a theory, which I talk about the theories that people have. I go to church and I hear what Jesus says about having good relationships, and oh, I love the pastor and the stories he tells. Do you do anything when you get home? Well, that's all kind of difficult. I've got this husband or I've got this child. They're difficult, and so we default away from and just keep all of the stuff we hear in church as theories. And so for most people, Christianity is a theory of persons, theory of the Trinity, if they even think about the Trinity, that has virtually no connection with what it looks like to live in a way that transforms beyond that. Torrance comes and brings in this kataphusin, this engaging, this active, speaking, living God who wants to engage us and speak to us. Bart, Deus Dixit, God speaks, is at the center of all that he does. So he doesn't allow a mere theory. In fact, all the theories, that's what Bart's going to call natural theology. They're just theories, generalizations that we come up with that in the end have very little to do with the real God and are just a caricature of God painted on the ceiling.
Mm.
The second part, the nature of bringing in Jesus as a therapist, again, for many people go to church to get techniques that Jesus gives. Well, Jesus went out and cared for the sick and the poor. So we're going to get a program in this church to, feed the people down in Pioneer Park, down in Pioneer Square. And they select things that Jesus does. Or I have a problem, so we'll go to the pastor, we'll ask the pastor to pray for me and my spouse, that he'd give us a love for one another and maybe give us some insights, some good Christian insights from Christian counseling. And again, the adjectives here mean abstracted sets of principles that may or may not have anything to do with Jesus or who we are, because they've been abstracted in the way, Geordie, you were pointing out earlier. And so Jesus just gets brought in when things get tough. We go and sing songs and all that. When it gets really tough, we bring Jesus in, and then we go back to our lives. And maybe we use some techniques that we get from the counseling and whatever, but we're not really impacted. So to say the nature of Torrance's Trinitarian scientific personalistic theology is that it is really a call to be entirely reoriented into the family who is God, and to recognize that our whole life, by the mediation of the Son, through the work of the Spirit, is to know ourselves as children of the Father, to know ourselves as brothers and sisters of Jesus, and to be, by the Spirit, ever attuned to, not just given insights in particular crunch situations, but every living, loving day to be attuned to what it is the Spirit's doing in the relationships in which we actually live. So this idea of the daily companionship that is there. And I think that Torrance doesn't get as far as I would like, but I think what he did, Ray Anderson and some others like him, Andrew Purvis maybe, are people who I think have taken the pointers that Torrance had here and have filled it out even more. Though there are some pieces that I think Torrance did get on this. The last paragraph at the bottom of 31, it is likely we have a Trinity deficit disorder. And I have a long section in my book, Face to Face. If you leave out the Father and you have just the Son and the Spirit, it creates certain disorders. If you have just the Father and the Spirit and leave Jesus out, you'll get all kinds of legalistic ways of being that are very empowered. If you have just the Spirit and leave out the Son and the Father, you're going to end up in all kinds of wild and wacky ways. Many people have just not dealt with all three persons of the Trinity to recognize that if you lose any one of them, you end up in some wacky form of religiosity that ends up either being profoundly controlling or profoundly out of control. And so the nature of Torrance's work in reorienting what I would call this therapeutic dimension is that it is only in knowing and being known by the person of Christ and knowing the people with whom we are positioned in life in practical, personal, particular kinds of ways that we come to be transformed into a knowing and being known that is the transformation of the Spirit into having us be those who reflect the image of the one that created us.
So the metaphor you want to lift up is being invited into this family of God, this participating with Jesus and his relationship with the Father by the Spirit.
In a very Katafusan kind of way, where you don't just sit there and say, I'm in the building, I'm in the family, but it's, I'm at the table and I need to know the people at this table every week, and I need to be in touch with them and with Jesus and the Father every week. It needs to be in the movie, The Story of Us. At every meal, they had what they called a high low, which I kind of adapt off on that on some things. But they say, what's your high point? What's your low point? When we walk into church, we should be able to tell somebody what the high points and low points of our life are. Otherwise, we just show up as a mask. So yes, show up for a family, but as real family and as real friends who are able to really participate with conversations about things that are real and not just what many people do, and that is go through motions, keep all the real stuff hidden, leave and hope nobody noticed.
Good stuff, Marty. Can you I'm tempted to have you read the whole conclusion, but I know it's a bit long.
I can leave you to your own conclusions. I don't know of it.
Yeah. Well, you pull everything together, I think, in there. It's kind of a bit of a summary of what you've taken us through. You're sort of advocating. Have you written on this? You talk about a Trinitarian family systems therapy.
Yeah, in chapter 9 of Face to Face Volume 3, the chapter 9 is called Puzzle Pieces: Trinitarian Theology and Family Systems Therapy. So yeah, I do walk through in the conclusion. I actually do have some new stuff in there beyond what I did in the earlier part. So Trinitarian family systems therapy is to really to think out of the Trinity as our true family, which Paul's statement, I bow my knee before the Father from whom every family in heaven and earth derives its name, which I would say its very being. So it's to do the good Trinitarian work and then to see how the language of family systems therapy plays that out is significant. The next paragraph on addictions, to say the nature of addictions is that addictions generally are that there is a loss in someone's life that they don't know how to deal with. They find some way to cover over it that satisfies it. And it can be drug and alcohol, it can be sex, love, whatever, but they're using it to cover over a painful or loss situation, and it takes over their life. And so to recognize the healing of our being requires that we get at those things that are the holes in our life, the missing painful pieces, and that the very nature of what theology does is not just wave a magic wand to the cross. It actually has a Jesus who knows and attends to all of the forms of dysfunction, both specifically, but also the way that plays out with other people. And again, I say the greatest addiction that people don't recognize is the addiction to acceptance. We so want to be accepted by people, we're willing to lie to them and ourselves about who we're willing to be. And so the church becomes the greatest codependent community where everyone's willing to lie about who they are, show up with a mask, and to not really deal with any of the issues of brokenness, of pain, of the things that are really impacting their lives. And so we need addiction therapy to be able to get at the roots of all of those things and to help people into true health and to not just try and take away the addictive substances and patterns that are there.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
I think oh yeah, attachment therapy is the other one. So attachment theory, Bowlby's work at attachment therapy, there is 4 positions. One of them is a secure attachment, and that means it's a secure position where you you feel that you are loved and good, and those who are your caregivers are loved and good. And in that context, people grow up to be relatively healthy and happy with not a lot of reactive ways of being. If you think the other person is not good, i.e., God's mad at me all the time, or I can never please God, you will end up with anxiety in your life that creates a disorientation and dysfunction that will run your life. And many churches are set up to create exactly that kind of dynamic with God or pastor or somebody like that. If I think I'm good, but the others are good, then we become detached, thinking, I'll never be part of a church. I'll never deal with that God because I'm good enough by myself. But we are detached. And so we end up with this kind of independence that breaks down our human relationships. We can't listen to people. The third position, the others are good and I'm not good. The world's going to hell in a handbasket. There's nothing I'm going to do about it or could do about it. And so I'm just going to live life and to hell with everybody else. And I think those 3 positions of detachment, not attached, are where most people live, but we don't have the theological language to talk about what it means to live in the love of God in a way that we are attached, that God is good and we are loved, beloved. God is fond of you, to use the language from the shack. And so people are wrestling all over the place with issues that could be made clear with attachment therapy, but we are blind to it because we don't have the lenses to recognize all of the issues that are theological issues with human manifestations and breakdown.
Mm. That's where I think your work is so important, Marty. And are there, and maybe this is a conversation for another time, but where in Torrance do you see Torrance making gestures towards the necessity, the importance of attachment to God? He wouldn't use that language, but
No,
I wonder
yeah.
if
Torrance's word for attachment is faith.
Hmm.
His sense of faith is a real knowing and engaging the other in such a way that it shapes my own belief system. So if I were to write a paper on attachment theory and T.F. Torrance, I would be unpacking his language of faith and the way he specifically uses it.
Hmm. Yeah, I think I've often thought at times that language evolves over time, and we start to be more, in some ways more integrative, and probably in some ways less integrative than our forebears. But we'll find a word like attachment, and it's been around for
Yeah,
a while, but it's usually hasn't moved into theological conversations until more recently.
yeah,
Uh, and yet, I think, and we can judge the people in the past because, well, they didn't use that word, they didn't think that way, but actually maybe they were thinking that way, and we've so
found the
if
words.
we just kind of go with your idea that when Torrance says faith, he's got a much more of an attachment model in his head. If that's true,
Yeah.
let's just imagine it's true.
Yes.
Then when he's saying faith all this time, we're actually hearing it in some poor idea, reductive idea of faith, when he
That's right.
actually means something much more in this personalistic.
Personalistic inner dynamic. Yeah.
Yeah.
We think faith, oh, that's about me. Faith, oh, it must be about me, and I need more faith and all that, instead of, oh, it's about the way I view myself in the context of the one who has attached himself to me in the person of Christ by the Spirit. And am I responding in a way appropriate to that? Am I seeing the security that he creates as one who is loved, nurtured, cherished? And when you get to there, it's much better. And so many people would think, yeah, I believe I have faith that God exists, and I think he's mad at me all the time. And it's like, yeah, that's not attachment. That's the a disambiguated kind of
Yeah.
position. It is a detached form of attachment.
There's
I was going to say, Bill,
comment.
on the
Yeah.
sharing in Jesus paracletic ministry. I wrote on paracletic ministry in 1992 when I was doing my PhD. I found one reference to the word there, and I also have chapters on paracletic ministry in my work. And I've supervised 2 doctor of ministry students at Shiloh University doing their doctoral work on bringing paracletic ministry to their form of leadership in the life of the church. And Ray Anderson was my 3rd doctoral examiner on my PhD because he is the most attuned probably in the world to the kind of work that I do. So
Hmm.
we are much on the same page. He had a profound openness to Torrancean kind of theology, but really believed it's got to hit the ground, hit churches, hit many disciplines, and he was creative in seeing it all. So he is quite an inspiration for me as well.
Well, Marty, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, you respond to that.
Oh, I saw the term, and with the Holy Spirit, it's familiar, but with Jesus, so I looked around and I found that link prior to our gathering here today. Thought I'd share it. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. And that term, Trinity what was it?
Trinitarian
disorder.
Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful. I mean, it's a horrible thing, but it's
there are a number of pages in my 3rd book that unpack that whole thing about playing out what happens if you lose each one of the persons of Trinity and the impact that it has.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
Well, Marty, would you maybe read your last paragraph for us, and we'll close with that?
I can
Anything
certainly
else
do
you
that.
wanna say?
Thomas Torrance had every reason to be concerned about the abuses and wrong thinking of personalism, just as he resisted dualistic problems in science. It is time for a revolution in the social and theological sciences. Torrance pointed the way forward even as he warned of the past. The future is full of possibilities. Jesus goes before us and with us. By his Spirit, Jesus fulfills in us what is in the heart of his Father, extending the kingdom of God for human flourishing in sharing God's life.
Excellent.
Which the 3 words there, that's the title of my 3rd book, Sharing God's Life. The subtitle.
So a lot of pointers in this toward that 3rd volume.
Yes, there are.
Well,
this
thank
3rd
you,
volume
Marty.
is, in a sense, my richest. It's my relational theology that pulls together a lot of these things. So, but this article really is bringing Torrance into a conversation that I didn't as fully in that book. It's much more Bart-centered. So this article furthers the conversation, and I've learned a lot since I wrote that book. So it does that.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your work. It's definitely some places to leap off from here. I'd love to see you just write another article that extends your conclusion. The things you bring up there, I think there's so much out there that would be helpful, and especially in this, it's really taking the theology of Torrance, the personalistic aspect of it, and making it concrete for spiritual formation and in the Christian life. And that's what we need. That's where we live.
Amen. And the book I am working on, which I have outlined and have begun working on, The Science of the Personal, Indwelling and Expanding, and indwelling, that's Polanyi, and expanding the methodology of T.F. Torrance, does exactly what you just said. It really explores how did Torrance come up with the things that he did have, and how have others moved beyond that, and then how do we keep going beyond even that?
All right. Well, I look forward to it, and would love to recommend that when it's ready.
Okay. Thank
Okay.
you for
Thank
wonderful
you.
interviewing, and for everybody else showing up with great comments and such today.
All right. Thank you all.
Good. Thank you.
That's a wrap.